feeling rather emotional today. I watched an anime called Reborn as a Vending Machine, I Now Wander the Dungeon. And the basic premise is there's this guy who really loves vending machines, and then he gets hit by a truck and dies, and isekai'd to a fantasy world as a vending machine. And then some girl finds him. And he can't really communicate because he's a vending machine. But then the girl decides to name him Boxo in the very last scene of the first episode. I just really started, I teared up. I teared up watching that last scene where she names him Boxo. I recently read this Royal Road fiction, this web novel called A Not So Simple Fetch Quest, and it was genuinely one of the most fucking deranged, unhinged things I have ever read, and it was amazing. So let's break it down. What are the things that I liked about this story? The plot is a fucking roller coaster. And there's no better way to describe it, because, quite frankly, that's exactly what it is. It's ridiculous. So, I'll at least establish the premise, which is there's this girl, and she wakes up isekai'd. A summoned hero come to help them slay the demon lord. But, in this story this time, she doesn't have to be the one who actually saves them from the demon lord. She simply just has to go up onto an altar and grab a holy sword. Because, for some reason, the goddess's blessing is only given to a summoned hero, and otherwise they're not allowed to enter the altar where there's a magical barrier that would prevent anyone else from entering it. So, she agrees. And she goes up and she grabs a sword, but before she does, she complains. She's like, coming into it, she's like, I don't want to hurt anyone, I don't want to do it. They're like, no, you don't have to hurt anyone. She's like, I don't want to kill anyone, I don't want to fight, I don't want my life in jeopardy. And they say, oh, no, you don't have to do that actually. All you have to do is just simply walk over there, grab that sword, go like 10 feet, grab it and bring it back to us. You'll be done and back home in 5 minutes. And then she starts complaining though. She's like, okay, well actually where's my adventure? Like an adventure is supposed to take years, not minutes. It's actually kind of lame, she thinks to herself. She says a little bit of that out loud too, but she mostly thinks these things. And then she grabs a sword, and in her head she hears the goddess's voice saying, oh, you want a years-long adventure. You want to be in a dungeon. You don't want to be here for 5 minutes. Request granted. And then she gets teleported to a dungeon. And that's where shit hits the fan. Everything goes nuts from there. What's really interesting about the story, and this is now, I'm going to get into characters. The main character is very multifaceted, and they definitely change over the course of the story. Although, I feel like, here's something I could complain about, but I actually don't think it's an issue. I think, in stories you have something that's really going to come and enrich your life, poses maybe a deep philosophical value, but for this story it's more like potato chips, I would say. Something like Candide by Voltaire. Now that is a full course meal right there, and that's a pretty short, light book. That's actually light reading too, but let's not get too deep into it. Anyway, the point is some books are full course meals that are just plumb full of depth. Is this story that? No, not really. It's potato chips, but it's the best goddamn, most delicious potato chips you could ever fathom. So, what's there to complain about there, really? I think it definitely achieves what it set out to do. One of the most interesting things about every other character besides the main character in this novel is that they're all just outwardly hostile to her. Basically, anyone that meets her is untrustworthy of her, and it kind of makes sense, because these first characters she meets, these foxkin, they've never met another sentient race in their dungeon. They didn't know that they existed, so they assume her to be some sort of vile monster, and whatever length she goes to try and convince them otherwise ultimately fail, whether that's inevitable because they're just refusing to be trustworthy or her own damn fault, is up for interpretation when you read the novel. Most of the characters in this novel seem not necessarily one note, because a lot of them change, but are more functions than characters. You don't really see real depth to them, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because it's really a story about the main character. However, there is one other interesting character who is the Black Dragon, which I'll get to later on when we get to the spoilers section. What's next? The pacing of the story is really effective. I think that it drags you along because there's always something interesting happening. There's always a challenge or some sort of obstacle that the main character has to face. And it never drags. You never really see much backtracking, although the story is kind of a whole exercise in backtracking, because one of the interesting things is, as I was saying earlier, when she first had her wishes granted by the goddess, she didn't want to be in danger, so that manifested as her respawning every time she dies. So this is one of those stories where the main character has to surmount insurmountable odds, and the way they do it is by just fucking dying over and over again and failing until they succeed, which I think are really interesting stories when done right, but definitely difficult to accomplish. However, this author, Kath Fatch, really did a good job here. So a lot of this novel is non-stop action, you know, and the action is really well written. I think that Kath Fatch's writing style is really easy to read. I never found myself getting confused, really. It's very terse, you know, it's a good light novel type writing style, you know, where it just describes what's going on without giving you unnecessary detail and leaving you plenty to understand the world and kind of picture it, because you're never going to have trouble picturing what's going on, and that's the kind of novel I love, where you fill in the gaps with your imagination and you're given all the tools to do so. I'm starting to realize I don't think I can get that much further with this story without just getting into the meat and bones of what happens in the story, because I think the most compelling thing is the story itself. That's really what pushes this novel along, and the most interesting twist ever at the end, and I think perfectly executed. It's just amazing how they sort of explained all the questions you end up having about this world, and they really subverted the common fantasy tropes in a lot of great ways with this twist, where it sort of explains some of the inconsistencies of your average fantasy. Basically, the goddess is the hero who is summoned. Now, that might be a little bit hard to parse at first, and I'll explain what happens, basically. Summoned to the dungeon is our hero, and upon finding themselves there, they realize things don't make no fucking sense, and they're not as they seem. She dies repeatedly and always finds herself in weird bondage situations with her enemies. Not virtually, every single foe that she ever meets in some way ties her up or restrains her and then murders her in hideously painful ways. From the carnivorous tree she finds in her first room to the spiders she finds in the next, webbing her up, the tree not rooting, but grabbing her with their roots and drowning her. She has a level up system, like in many of these types of novels, and you know, we never really question why that's just, oh, it's the goddess, of course. Well, in this, she ends up getting more and more power until she's getting to the point where she ends up interacting with the void, which is a plane of existence beyond our understanding. It's the bridge, the gap between existences, and then there's a lot of power that can be drawn, a divine realm almost, or the realm which houses the gods that they draw their power from. And as she levels up, you know, she gets the basic stuff, like extra strength at first and stuff like that. But then, when she finally finds her way down to the depths of the abyss, the final layer of the dungeon, she encounters at the void, and from it starts getting interesting level ups. The class skills she starts to be able to acquire go from, being able to, manipulate space and dimensions, to omnipotence. She ends up with omnipotence at some point after she's come back to the human realm and figures out, wait, this is not making sense. Omnipotence, how can be omnipotent? And she picks something called paradox. She gets the ability that just says a cause without an effect, an effect without a cause. And then it comes around to her realizing she is the goddess and she created herself, which is fucking crazy. What a twist. In conclusion, the comedy of this all really comes from the fact that the main character, the protagonist, suffers so immensely in situations that they actually put themselves in. Why is the universe so fucked up? Why is this dungeon so fixated on putting her in bondage situations? Well, it's because she invented it. She did it all to herself. She created this world, and thereby all the situations that she encounters. And that is just one of the most humorous fucking things ever. And even before you learn this, even before this revelation, this story is honestly one of the more humorous ones that I've read. I don't think I've enjoyed many other stories on Royal Road this much. It is really amazing. And the depths of depravity they're riveting. The protagonist commits just full-blown genocide. Like, they literally fuck shit up on a level I've never seen. The killing, the murder, the slaughter that they resort to is incomprehensible. They grow beyond their past mistakes by resolving them through newly gained powers. But it's interesting that the character themselves doesn't really change. They don't want to do these horrible, awful things that they do to all these countless people. But they do them anyway. And they don't get better and start reacting to situations differently. I mean, they're very quick to just resort to violence and murder people, but it's justified, It's not really like an eye for an eye. It's like, oh, you cut my leg off, I'm gonna kill you. Like, they didn't come out with violent intentions, but they respond with violence nonetheless. So it's interesting then that instead of changing as a person necessarily, they just grow more power that allows them to avoid situations, but they don't really approach things differently. I think this is a trope that you see a lot in these kind of fantasy progression novels, where the growth isn't necessarily in the heart of the character, but it's more so in their capacity to affect the world around them, which is a really satisfying story. Wouldn't we all want to have more control over our surroundings? It's funny then that they had control the whole time, and that ultimately all the situations that torment them are of their own making. I would highly recommend this story to anyone interested in fantasy novels, especially those looking for something a little bit different and more subversive. This has a lot to offer, and it's funny. The comedy is, I think, the main selling point of this story. I love that shit. Alright, thanks for watching. This video fucking sucked ass. I should script this type of stuff next time. I feel like a goddamn clown.